Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Earth Day live webinar, Fitting Fashion for the Future. I'm Shelley Rogers, the coordinator of Fashion for the Earth at earthday.org, and today we'll be discussing a very important bill introduced in the New York State Legislature by Assemblymember Anna R. Kelez and Senator Alessandra Biaggi that will, if passed, change the course of this $2.5 trillion fashion industry. It's called the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act, but is better known by its shorter name, the Fashion Act. On our panel today, we are honored to have with us Assemblymember Kelez, who represents the 125th District of New York State. She may be joining us somewhat late. Maxime Bédot, the founder of the New Standard Institute and author of Unraveled, The Life and Death of a Garment. She is also been very instrumental in the putting together of this bill. And Michelle Gabriel, a scholar of fashion who teaches in the and is the program director in the Sustainable Fashion program, a master's program at Glasgow Caledonian New York College. We are also honored to have with us Brittany Sierra as our moderator. She is the founder and CEO of the Sustainable Fashion Forum, a very important gathering every year. It's also a global community for conscious fashion and sustainability advocates. Before we begin, I thought I would just start with some opening words on behalf of Earth Day. Most people are really think of fashion as a good thing. It's a fun thing. It's a creative thing. It's how we express ourselves. It's how we get across our identity. Most people are entirely unaware that the fashion industry does any harm to the earth or to all living things on it, much less the magnitude of that harm. So I thought I'd just recite a few bullet points to kind of put us on this in the same way of thinking here, a framework for this. The fashion industry today produces 100 billion garments, and that's a conservative estimate. And 87% of these garments will end up in an incinerator or a landfill. And nowadays, with more and more frequency, more being used, much less than before. Only 1% of clothes are actually recycled. The industry is responsible for 4% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the carbon output of the UK, Germany, and France combined. Some estimates are that the fashion industry is responsible for 20% of all industrial wastewater. In the case of fashion, this is a toxic cocktail of carcinogenic materials, hazardous materials, heavy metals, that are dumped into clean river systems and rivers, which greatly impact those who live around them, who use these waters for farming, for drinking. Conventional cotton farming relies on the heaviest use of pesticides of any other crop. And again, these pesticides get into local rivers, streams, aquifers, and harm ecosystems and cause biodiversity loss. 150 million trees are taken down every single year for our cellulosic fabrics. Those are rayon or viscose. The majority of our clothes today are made with synthetics. Either they're purely synthetic or they have synthetics mixed into them. These synthetics are predominantly polyester, acrylics, elastane, spandex. They're made from petroleum products. The chemical name from oil. The chemical name for these these fibers and fabrics is PET, or the longer name polyethylene terephthalate. But when we wash our synthetic clothes, we are collectively sending many millions of microplastics into the ocean. Fish eat these, shellfish eat these, birds eat these. Today, 35% of the ocean microplastics are from our washing of our synthetic clothing. And in March, a university in Amsterdam found that 80% of the people tested had PET in their bloodstreams. So we are, in fact, ingesting our own synthetic clothes. And you might say our synthetic clothes are becoming part of us, literally. Last, but certainly not least, millions of garment workers toil, mostly throughout the world, but predominantly in the global south. They work in very unsafe conditions with no representations. It's backbreaking work. And they are not making what we would consider a living wage by any means, sometimes barely that country's stated minimum wage. And they are working for some of the richest companies in the world, owned by some of the very richest people in the world. The fashion industry is almost entirely unregulated, and those points are some of the reasons why we need the Fashion Act. And now, without further ado, we'll turn this over to our moderator, Brittany Sierra. Thank you so much, Brittany, for moderating today.
Yes, thanks, Shelley, and thanks, everyone. Welcome. My name is Brittany Sierra, as she mentioned, and I'm the founder of the Sustainable Fashion Forum, and I am thrilled to be leading this conversation today. As we just heard, I think it's so interesting because when we think about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, we don't tend to think about fashion as a pain point. However, as we just heard, there are fashion's impact on people and planet is massive. And the average citizen may not know about fashion's impact, but I would like to believe that governments and those that are in charge do know about its impact. So, Michelle, to kick us off, why do you think that the fashion industry is so unregulated? And why has it been unregulated for so long?
It's a really great question, Brittany. The fashion industry holds like a really special space in the world. It is the oldest industrialized sector. It is arguably the biggest industry in the world. It touches every single human every day, whether you think fashion's cool or you don't care, whether you buy high end, whether you buy low end. So it has this very kind of special dynamic in that it is so ubiquitous. It is such a significant industry to the world, $2.5 trillion as of 2017. So it's likely more than that. And it has this powerful kind of social component, this cultural component. However, despite all these kind of big things, it's also very often relegated to gender as an issue. So it's heavily worked and populated by women. It is seen as frivolous and indulgent. That's a quote from BOF's inaugural State of Fashion report in 2017. So even they acknowledge kind of like the low end that the fashion industry holds in terms of like geopolitical power. However, it's actually actioning that power. So it's really complicated, but that dynamic makes it hang under the radar for people that are power brokers in the world, that are endeavoring policy, that are doing governmental work, but also still being able to do its bad stuff. So it's really a bunch of things. And it's mostly that it's just not, in my opinion, that it's not seen as important when it really, really, really is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, we're here to talk about the Fashion Act, and we got a brief introduction into, the impact of fashion. So, Maxine, can you share with us a bit more about what the Fashion Act is and what it's going to require from brands if it's passed into law?
Yeah, sure. So the Fashion Act is really, I think, best described broken up into three parts. The first part is the prerequisite for what companies have to do to address their impact. And basically what the Fashion Act is attempting to do is really set a floor for how garments are going to be produced, or not especially, but particularly companies that wish to sell to the New York market. So first, just before describing what's in the meat of the bill, I want to describe what companies are targeted by this bill. Mm-hmm. So it's using the kind of California fuel efficiency standard approach to legislation. The fuel efficiency approach in California was that California knew they had a very large market, that if they set standards, if you want to sell a car in the state of California, this is how you have to do it. And it managed to shift how cars were built globally. That's very much using the same approach. So the Fashion Act is any company wishing to sell to the state of New York, in the state of New York, that has global revenue over $100 million. So think of your significant mall brands, your major players. This is where the revenue is consolidated in this sector of the industry, and they really have the capacity and the responsibility to do
Oh my
this.
God, you've got to be kidding me.
There we go. Assemblymember Kellis is on with us. Fantastic. Hi, Assemblymember Kellis. I'm just walking through just the basics of the bill, and I can hand it over to you, or Brittany. I think maybe the next question is geared towards you, Assemblymember Kellis. But just so that's who the bill reaches, and then there is kind of three steps to the bill. The first is that at the moment, the industry doesn't even know where it's producing its product. You cannot address the impacts of your product supply chain if you do not even know where your suppliers are, who they are, what impact that they're having. So the first step of the Fashion Act is this supply chain transparency, which is really mandating not just that the companies are disclosing this to the public, but that they know it themselves. And that's going to be the first part of work in order to be able to assess their impact and then draw down that impact. So that's step number one. But that's only the prerequisite. Now companies know where their supply chain actually is. And then the meat of the bill is really a requirement that companies reduce the impacts on their negative impacts. And they have to do it sufficiently. And there's very clear guidance that is referenced in the bill itself that really narrows down and defines exactly what that risk mitigation looks like and what the requirements are. And then there's kind of baked in, and it's based on both environmental and social impacts, so looking at labor and the environment. And then there are other sort of baked in benchmarks in this, what is called mandatory due diligence, which includes on the climate front, as Shelley mentioned at the outset, and Brittany, you spoke to as well, the fashion industry is an enormous contributor to the climate crisis. It requires companies set and achieve science-based targets. Put simply, it requires companies reduce their greenhouse gas emissions within their supply chain to be in line with the Paris Agreement. So it is to operate in line with the bounds of the planet as the leading scientists have determined. That's on the climate side. And then there are additional disclosures in the bill that give evidence point to some evidence of whether the companies are actually moving in the right direction. So there are disclosures around the greenhouse gas emissions. There's disclosures around material use. We right now have very little insight into how, there's figures that are thrown around from 80 million to 150 billion in terms of how many units of clothing are produced every year. We have very little insight into that. This would mandate disclosures on material use. And then there's additional disclosure on wages of garment workers and how that compares both to a minimum wage and to a local living wage. I think Shelley mentioned this at the outset, but within the garment industry, the research that has been done has found that not just that the garment workers are not receiving a living wage, they are not even receiving the legal minimum wages in the countries in which they are operating. So this bill would go hopefully a very long way in making progress on that front. And then just finally, in terms of enforcement, because you can have the best law known to man, but if it's not enforced, it's pretty useless. So there's real teeth to this bill. It includes that the enforcement is through the Attorney General's office in New York, and the Attorney General can fine a company up to 2% of global revenue for having infringed on the law. And then there's also a contemplation of a civil suit provision as well, so that would be really first of its kind in this country, that would give an individual that is harmed as a result of a fashion company's insufficient due diligence it would give them standing to bring a case against the company for the harms that they've received. So that's sort of in broad brushstrokes, maybe a little bit of detail as well, kind of what the Fashion Act is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot there, and there's a lot that I would love to unpack. I think first, because we have so many people joining us that have varying levels of understanding when it comes to fashion and the supply chain, can you just briefly explain to us what a supply chain is? And Maxine, this question was directed for you. So can you share that?
I stole Assemblymember Kellis's question. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
So yeah, a supply chain is the steps. If you think about how a garment is produced, if it is my shirt is probably, if I'm being honest, a natural synthetic blend, the kind of worst thing that you want to have. So its supply chain is starting in a cotton field and in an oil rig. And then those fibers are going from the oil rig to a chemical plant to be processed into fibers. The cotton is going to a gin, and then those fibers are going to go to a textile mill where they will be spun into yarn, knit. This is a knit fabric, or woven into fabric that will then be cut and sewn somewhere else. That is what we are talking about when we talk about a supply chain. Everything from the cotton farm and oil rig all the way through to the garment that we're ultimately purchasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and working in the industry, as you mentioned, and I think we've talked about, the supply chain is really complex, and it's nuanced, and it's incredibly fragmented and spread across many different countries. So that often leads to this lack of transparency where brands don't know where their product is being made. And so I guess with that in mind, something that comes to mind for me is, will they actually be able to map this, especially once they start getting into the more ambiguous areas of the supply chain? And I guess Maxine or Assembly Member Kellis, one of y'all. But yeah, I guess that's my question is, if we know how difficult it is to map the supply chain, and we know how fragmented and just sort of jumbled it is, how are they going to be able to do this?
So I'll jump in on that one. I think it's really important to note that there's precedent already for this. So there is another industry that is equally consolidated in the United States, which is the food industry, right? And knowing when you're eating a box of something and you're seeing 90% of it are chemicals, right? And we have a world now cash crops in the food industry. And there was a movement and there was a success to require large industries that had a revenue over a certain dollar amount to do mapping in the very similar way, analogous way. And that has been done. It was done several years ago. Companies the size of Frito-Lay, right? So you would think it would be equally difficult. It is equally difficult, and it is proven to be possible. So I think that precedent shows that if the need is there, if the regulation is there, they will find a way.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that with industry specifically. Is there is now two things to note. One is that the opacity of the industry has been built by the industry itself. So it wasn't always this way. The industry pushed for this global, not just global, but opaque world in which they were just, the brands were just working with intermediaries who were then, developing the whole supply chain. So they have created this world. So it's a little bit unfair to, now say, well, it's just too complicated because they've made it complicated. And then on a more just practical level, there are companies now such as Oratain. There's also legal precedent in the legislation that is ensuring that our products are not being produced with forced Uyghur labor. So there are companies that are operating that are actually, working through on how to, tag a garment's full supply chain starting from that raw fiber. So it's both, as Assemblymember Kellis said, there's legal precedent for it. The industry has created, this opacity now, and it's, now their responsibility, and there is technical feasibility to do this work.
Well, and I would also note that part of the requirement of mapping will, in and of itself, shift practices, and that's part of the purpose and intention, right? What choices a large company makes will be influenced by the companies they want to purchase from that create their own transparency. So that is how it will create a step effect throughout the entire supply chain.
And just to go back to the question earlier, Brittany, and tie back what these ladies have shared, is part of all of this is also why we don't have policy, a dynamic policy landscape for fashion. We don't have information to build benchmarks from, to move forward from there. We have an industry that has baked in from the literal beginning, the opacity and the layers of complexity in order to take advantage for profit purposes that it has now. And so that's always been, and that just creates a challenging dynamic.
What a great segue. Thank you so much, because it perfectly goes into my next question, which is about a major piece of this bill, which is the disclosure piece. And we know that greenwashing is a massive issue at the intersection of fashion and sustainability and marketing. And considering that a huge component of this bill is based around disclosure, meaning that, brands are self-reporting, if there's already so much greenwashing going on and so much greenwashing in fashion, how can we ensure that this bill will actually be impactful if brands are essentially grading their own work? Like, how can we take this information and then create, the necessary infrastructure to create change if it's based on them basically saying, yeah, we're doing a good job. Yeah.
Right. I think it's really important for people to know that they aren't grading their own work. That is not the structure of the way that this bill has evolved. First, the data and reporting has to be easily accessible, and it has to start with outlining an evaluation and a reporting of baseline risks, both with respect to the environment and with respect to labor rights, and then identify specific actions necessary, and then track the progress. And the due diligence is defined as identification, prevention, mitigation, and accounting. So we're very clear on how due diligence is defined. And for the energy and greenhouse gas emissions, those are must be evaluated legally by the way the statute is written, by an independent entity following corporate accounting and reporting standards. And this is outlined in the absolute contraction approach. So it is an already identified standard mechanism of evaluation, identified by multiple environmental groups collectively. That's also really important. Another piece that's important is that if any individual, as it's written right now, can bring a complaint to the Attorney General to bring attention to what's going on. And the Attorney General, of course, would then be responsible to investigate. And as it's written now, there is also the option, if there is an experience or abuse or things like, say, theft, wage theft, a civil case could be brought forward by an individual. So there are many layers for holding them accountable. Besides the fact that in the way that the bill is written, the AG, they would be required to put their annual reports, and the AG would be responsible for bringing any cases forward if they are not reaching their targets. And if they do not, then they could be fined up to 2% of their gross. And that is what would create the fund that would be used to counter some of the harms that are being done by the industry right now. So there are many different points throughout the way the bill is written that that would hold them accountable beyond their own greenwashing or self-evaluation.
Yeah, just to build on what Assemblymember Kellis has laid out for us, is that I think it's very helpful when we're thinking about these things and people who are new to the policy realm is, first of all, there's a requirement, as Assemblymember Kellis said, that these are independently third-party audited. So this is not, there is in no way is it you're grading your own homework. There is a third party that has to do that. And then in addition, there is the Attorney General and a civil supervision. So I think the thing to think about is when we pay our taxes, right? So that's actually, we don't get it third party audited. We don't even have that requirement, but we tend to pay our taxes because we are concerned that if we do not, we could go to jail or there would be consequences. And that's very much in any legal system that you're developing. You are creating rules of the game and significant enough consequences so that the people that are, the companies that are playing in that game are motivated to do the right thing. And that's really what has been set up. So there's no part of this that companies are, grading their own homework, or it's really an attempt very much to move away from this space where they can say anything and there's no accountability on the other side.
Well, and actually, to your point, it essentially creates that same kind of mechanism, paying your taxes, that you could be audited at any point in time. So although you may not be in every single year, the likelihood will be determined over time, but the chance that you would be is also a driving factor, because the consequences of a 2% on total gross is pretty significant.
Yeah. One of the questions that I was thinking about when I was thinking about these third-party audits, in the fashion industry, we've seen like a lot of organizations, third-party organizations, coming under fire for basically being accused of enabling greenwashing, not providing accurate data in the proper context that it's being used. And so we've seen a lot of this happening, where a lot of these third-party organizations, people are questioning whether or not they are actually moving the needle and actually helping the industry move forward, or if they're just allowing their members, who are paid members in a lot of times, to basically say that they're doing work that they're not. So one of the questions that I had is, as you're thinking about, or maybe you've already thought this through and figured out who these third-party organizations are, like, what is the process or the thought process behind choosing these folks? And I guess, like, are there checks and balances for the checks and balances, ensuring that that we're not perpetuating just, okay, they're a member, they're doing the best that they can, this is hard, so we'll just give them a passing grade, when actually there is more that could be done. And if we pushed harder, they could make more change, and we could maybe solve this problem a little faster. I don't know
to that a little bit.
If I understand what you're asking, I think it's really important that the third party does not come from the industry. That first is very important. The standards that were identified, for example, for the environmental standards, those came from a collective of environmental organizations nationally and internationally, like the World Wildlife Fund, right? So they do not have a vested interest in protecting the environmental violations of the industry. That is not who they, that's not who they report to. And I think that it's very, very important that you aren't finding third-party entities that themselves have vested interest in there not being a robust regulation or oversight. And that is the same, of course, with respect to the labor component and the criteria being designed, again, based on international standards that are very rigorous and known and accepted outside of the context of the industry. So I think both of those things are really important. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but super critical that it comes from the outside of the entire industry. And I just, I want to make clear too, and I apologize for having technical difficulties, so this may have been clarified, but why this is so incredibly important. In the context of the fact that the United Nations reports that came out in the last month and a half, have they get glaringly more critical and pointing out how extreme our situation is. We look at climate change as something that's happening in the future, a crisis that is coming. And what they have clarified is the crisis not only has come, but we've actually passed a lot of the markers. And we are now looking at the damage that, and trying to calculate the damage that is irreversible. They've also communicated that unless we reduce our total GHG emissions by 50% in the next 8 years globally, we will not prevent the worst of the climate impacts. So just to put a parameter on why we're looking at this industry, because this entire global industry causes or results in about 3 to 8%, depending on which measures you're looking at, of the total GHG emissions globally. Which means to me, we cannot reach our climate goals globally unless there is regulation of this industry. So it isn't superfluous or on a whim, or I don't think that we can move forward as a species unless we get a handle on this particular industry that is very wasteful. And also, as we know, on the other side, is one of the greatest factors driving slave labor and child labor in the world. So, both of those can't be addressed unless we pass legislation that has teeth, because there have been previous legislation that has sought transparency, but on a volunteer basis, that has not worked. The data shows, there was really good data that came out last year that showed it has not changed or moved the needle. So this isn't a first attempt. This is we now know from all of the work that's been done over the last several decades that anything short of enforcement or something with teeth will not achieve the goals we need.
Yes, and I will just hearken exactly what Assemblymember Kellis is saying. The absence of meaningful, forcible change is keeping us exactly where we are, which is a lot of talk and not a lot of action. And that information that will be disclosed via the Fashion Act and hopefully other ongoing policy initiatives allows for benchmarking under the auspices of the Fashion Act, but also outside of that. We just really have an absence of almost complete information for the space, which is holding us in the holding pattern that is leading to our destruction. And so ultimately, getting that data allows us to evaluate that data. It allows research to be endeavored. It allows other organizations to come up in support of where we're hoping to push the industry. Right now, in an industry-led dynamic, we only get the information they want to disclose. We do not have fully disclosed information in order to see whether that's viable, correct, accurate. We have very limited consumer protections accordingly. And so the opportunity for viable data that we can evaluate for its viability, in addition to it being audited in these third-party dynamics, is going to meaningfully transform the industry, in my opinion.
And just to build off of what Assemblymember Kellis and Michelle has said on the auditing side, because I devoted a whole chapter to my book on the auditing regimes. And so I think we need to separate first the third-party certifications that brands get to try to have sustainable claims with the audits that they do with their facilities. So auditing is not a perfect institution. It's not an institution. It's not a perfect process, I should say. But no process is perfect. And that's why you have auditing. That is one checks and balance. It is not perfect, but it is important to have. These companies are very large companies that do this auditing. They have a reputation that they need to hold as well. So so we have that piece, and then we have the attorney general, right? And we have the civil suit provision. So you have the attorney general that can go and investigate and make sure that these audited disclosures, this audited process, these audited benchmarks are actually being achieved. And so that's, I think, a very important new dynamic, and we're making this very squishy, loose kind of report what you want, and it doesn't have to be perfect, to now there is serious consequences if you are found to inaccurately be showing progress or not. So we have a policeman, like that's, I think, the really significant piece of this legislation. And then we have it's much better to have something that is audited versus like you don't have to have that audited at all. We need to take each of these steps and make something as strong as possible, which is what Assemblymember Kellis has done with the Fashion Act.
And I think it's also really important to know that the bill targets companies specifically that have a gross that is over 100 million. So we're not targeting every mom and pop that doesn't have the financial means to track their entire supply chain. I think it's really important to note that. Secondly, it's also really important to note that the purpose of legislation, of law, is to create a framework that will ensure that the economic development can prosper without causing damage to individuals, right? So we are tasked with the responsibility of protecting public health, right, of natural resources. That is our job in government. And so we have this industry that isn't regulated at all. And the bill is walking a fine line to create a framework in which companies can prosper and people are also able to prosper, that the health is ensured of both the environment and people. And the third thing that I think is really important is that if we create this framework, then everyone in that is held accountable has to align with that framework, which means that those who have done this voluntarily, right now in the context that we have of no regulation at all, are in a sense being penalized for trying to do the right thing. But if we create a baseline framework that everybody has to meet, it equalizes the playing field, which is why you see industry representatives like Ferrera, who have supported this, coming out and saying, no, this is very, very good because it creates this even playing field for all of us, a baseline quality that we all have to adhere to so that no one is penalized. I think that's very important to note, that some people actually look to this and want this and have been waiting for this in the industry.
Yeah, you all are giving me such great segues because that was my next question. Thank you. Michelle, I was going to ask, what has been the fashion industry's response to this bill? Have people embraced it? Have they been excited for it? I imagine that there are those that are afraid of it. So what has been the vibe since this bill has been introduced?
Yeah, it's been an interesting vibe. So it's a challenging dynamic for sure. What Assemblymember Kellis mentioned is 100% right. Businesses that are already endeavoring to do positive impact, sustainability, socially conscientious or ethical work in the course of their business are penalized by higher costs. And so they're looking for a more level playing field. So there is a section of this industry already endeavoring this work, building value out of sustainability and social impact, who are like, yes, please level this playing field in ways that allow me a little bit more of a space to compete with the Sheins, with the mega sized producers and the mega sized profit capturers. However, there is also fear in the industry, and the industry has gotten away for almost 300 and some change years without regulation. That fear, in my opinion, comes from kind of a lack of knowledge about how this process goes. Most industries have a very native relationship with the government in whatever way, whether it's local, federal, international, depending on the type of business they do. The fashion industry does not have that relationship as dynamically as other spaces. And so, there's a lot of companies that don't have general counsel. They don't literally have people advising or guiding or just understanding how this might be, or expecting. Most industries expect regulation on some level at some point in time. It literally comes for us all. And it is more advantageous for a business to be a partner in that dynamic than it is to be an outsider in which it is imposed upon. All of this is just to say, I think that portions of the industry are afraid, and that drives their unwillingness to engage in policy dynamics. But they also are like, we're doing okay. We get to talk about this. We don't get held accountable, and are not necessarily looking forward to a world where some of their information is laid bare.
I would just build off of what Michelle was saying. If we look at the auto industry, and back to the fuel efficiency standards, the auto industry, the legacy companies went kicking and screaming, trying to lobby to not have those fuel efficiency standards passed. They did not want to be regulated. Despite that, those laws were passed, and we had fuel efficiency standards. As a result of those laws, you had big, successful domestic companies like Tesla that took advantage of that and became very successful. You also had legacy companies like Ford that really turned the ship around as a result. So much so that when the Trump administration tried to get those laws repealed, the industry said, no, now we want it. Like, now we see that it's a level playing field and that it's good for us as an industry. So I think that's, we're in some respects seeing that same dynamic play out, where you have leaders who understand, who want to be a part of the future, who say, like, this is the type of law we need. That's the Stella McCartneys of the world, the Mara Hoffmans of the world, the Nikkis of the world. They know what the future, like, that the future that they want to be a part of, and that they know that this act is central to that. And then you have some legacy players that are not being true leaders, and they're saying they just want to stick their head in the sand and operate without scrutiny forever, and exploit land and labor for profit maximization. And that's a very old way of thinking, but I think that's where we're really seeking out and need to have leadership within the industry that says, like, we want to be a part of this future. And we're very pleased that there certainly is at least a part of the industry that is thinking that way.
Absolutely.
When you have to think about it too, the way systems work, why is it fundamentally that people and industries, companies and industries don't want change, is because they have designed their business models on the existing system of regulations. So there will invariably be an adjustment to their business model to any change in regulation. So of course, the first response is, I've already maximized my efficiency in the existing framework, don't change anything. But that is the epitome of a sunk cost fallacy. Just because it's the existing model that we have doesn't mean that it's right. And also the environment has changed, which may mean that something was right previously that currently or now isn't right. I don't think this model of not having any regulation or oversight or transparency was ever right, or we wouldn't have led to such great levels of GHG emissions or child labor or wage theft in the industry, right? But I think that's what you're looking at more than anything. And that should never be a reason that we do not move forward with regulation. There will always be industry influence because industry has a tremendous amount of money. And so there will inevitably be some pushback to keep the system as it is. for that exact reason, that again should not drive our decision. The evaluation should be on whether it's well written, whether it will in fact create a level playing field, not create the economic destruction that there is this fear of, and that is how we determine that by precedent, and there is tremendous precedent with this one. And the thoroughness that we're having in this process, and also other partners. For example, labor. That is another incredibly important group of people that we are connecting with, and their interest is to protect the workers, and so they will have an influence in this as well.
And just to add one last additional thing, yes, love the snaps, Maxine. Both of these ladies have said, because the fashion industry as an industry and as a market and as a sector is a really challenging one. It is highly competitive, and it is a space of really low innovation compared to other sectors. And so innovation can take place within policy. Policy can force innovation. Sustainability and impact are a form of innovation. Businesses within the fashion space that endeavor to be party to this and push the industry to a space we know it has to exist to not be as destructive as it is, and to continue on its own laurels, let alone, to protect the planet and people. This could be that innovative moment that creates value in a new space of less competition for a period of time. Of course, competition goes on and on, but the space is so hungry for an innovation, and this can be it. And so companies that are afraid are, I would argue, not seeing this from quite the right lens.
Right. There's so many examples. Building codes, state building codes is like a perfect example. People don't think about it because it's in the background now, but it's constantly improving, and it's constantly requiring more and more sustainable infrastructure, right? It's like, there are total industries that have innovated because of regulations that were mentioned earlier. We just passed a piece of legislation in New York State. By 2035, all cars sold in New York State have to be electric. Of course, that is going to push the market itself, because we are impacting demand. And that is what we're doing here. If we create transparency, we can influence demand in and of itself, because there are so many people who want to do the right thing. They want to buy food and buy clothing that they know did not create wage theft or slave labor or destruction of their environment or increased in asthma rates in environmental justice communities. But if they don't know, we're so impacted by our other everyday things, we move on to the next thing. But if every piece of clothing that you put on your back, you can feel good about it. Every single thing that you put in your mouth, you can feel good about it. You know where it came from. How empowering. That power has been taken away from the consumer. This is a consumer positive bill. It is pro transparency, to help them make good choices, which will drive the market. And those that choose to really take a lead in that industry are the ones who will benefit from it. So, it'll be courage, but it's also creation of a really exciting move forward if they choose to take it that way, if they choose to take that challenge on. And I don't see that as a bad thing.
Yeah, I have so many questions, but we're running out of time. Like, I still have so many questions about who was involved in the making of the act and revisions. And so I'm thinking through like which questions should I do before we go into our audience questions. But I think one thing that I saw when the bill came out, where there were a lot of people in the industry that were saying, well, wait, like this wasn't included, or these people weren't at the table. So I guess like trying to condense like 5 questions into one. Maybe like, how did you go about deciding like who to include in this? So remember, Kellis, you mentioned that the labor groups that were involved. So how did you decide like who to include? And then I guess because of the feedback and the excitement about this bill and what it could potentially mean for the industry, there have been those who have given revisions or submitted revisions. So I guess, where is the bill now with those revisions and those thoughts being added to the conversation?
So there are groups, labor representative groups, that have been working nationally and internationally in this field on other pieces of legislation. They were natural partners that we have been working with. There are also labor unions in New York State that we are working with. And those are, again, natural partners. And sometimes people reach out to us and say, I have insights or thoughts on this, I want to set up a meeting. That's my job, is to meet with constituents. And we have found some great partners that way, researchers who work on labor rights issues, both nationally and internationally. So that's on the labor side. We have the same with environmental groups. Also, it's important to note that we are basing these, the guidelines that we're using to establish the criteria that businesses will need to follow on international standards, including, from the UN, right? So this is, and those are global. And there are many of those national and international standards that we are using as the foundation. So, so that's to answer your first question. And it's important for people to know, when you are trying to do something that is foundational, that is a pivot, a shift, policy doesn't happen overnight, and particularly not when you are as collaborative as we are trying to be. I mentioned labor, I mentioned the international organizations, but we're also, of course, working with representatives from the industry, so that the industry is absolutely at the table. It's so important because, of course, they know, what would be caveats or unintentional consequences that we should be aware of, and then we can address if need be. So we are in that process, and it should not be rushed. And legislation in New York State, in particular, it can take a year or two. So that does not deter me at all. I have another piece of huge legislation. It took a year and a half, and that was fast. I think that this could absolutely. We have maybe 8 more days left of actual targeted session right now, and the standing committees have already finished meeting. So we are now working with our organizations and our collaborators to bring this back in a final form in January, which is very exciting. That what is important and what makes a bill move fast, which this will, is that by the time you are working it through committees, you already have worked with anyone who was an important stakeholder, including the Attorney General's office, for example. And that is something that we're doing upfront, so that by the time it gets to committees and by the time I'm bringing it to leadership, we have done all the work that they would have wanted us to do in order to move it forward. So that's very promising.
And I would just to add to that, before we turn to questions, you asked, Brittany, who has the seat at the table? As Assemblymember Kellis said, and I know both the Assemblymember Kellis and Senator Biaggi on the Senate side have said this is the most feedback they've received, from any bill that, they've worked on. But they are meeting with everybody that has feedback. So who's at the table? Anybody who wants to have a seat at the table has a seat at the table. Yeah. And I think that's, very much kudos to their teams, to Assemblymember Kellis, Senator Biaggi, and their teams for doing that engagement. Because we are all a part of this. We are a part of it if it moves forward or if it doesn't, and this industry continues not to be regulated. So everybody, has a stake in this and has a seat at the table.
And just so people are aware, the bill is assigned to a committee. It will need to go through that standing committee. This one, because of fiscal impacts may also go through a second committee before it then will go to the floor for a consent agenda. A bill like this would probably be pulled off the consent agenda and would go to a debate agenda, and then join a very long list of hundreds of bills that are on the debate agenda. And then we would do a tremendous amount of advocacy to get it on a debate agenda, meaning to get it onto the floor for debate. So there are at least 3 to 4 hurdles that it will need to go through. And the advocacy from the people, I cannot emphasize enough how incredibly important. People sometimes feel disempowered because government seems so obtuse and so distant. But I can tell you that if a member of mine receives even 10 letters, 10 emails, 20 emails from their constituents in their district that they urge them to sign onto a bill, it will bring that bill up to a priority for that legislator. And that legislator will reach out to me and set up a meeting to understand that bill better. Or they may simply sign on, depending on the thoroughness of the email that was sent and the information. Even better if a constituent asks to set up a meeting with their legislator and talks through the bill. And that's something that is hugely impactful. On my end, we do legislative briefings to educate our colleagues, writing op-eds, all of those. So there's something we call the inside-outside game, that the legislators who really understand how the system works understands you can't disregard the public. You have to both educate and you have to both educate and activate. That's hugely important while you are simultaneously educating from the inside, both staff within the legislative house that you're in, as well as leadership, as well as your colleagues, urging to get co-sponsorship, which residents can do as well to urge their representatives to get on as co-sponsors and champion the bill. So that's what I mean by this, inside outside game, both working together, is so incredibly important, and in particular for a bill that is this transformative.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I have like a million questions, but we have like 4 minutes left. But I saw a question in the audience that was about how this bill could potentially impact other places. And it made me think about the fact that there's legislation that's happening all over the globe in different places. And a question that I was thinking about to piggyback on the audience question of how this can impact other states in the US, but then also thinking about how can we make it so that the legislation that we're putting forth, both in the US and abroad, and worldwide, isn't disjointed and like speaks to each other. And I guess like my question is, how do we prevent it from being that bad actors or those who don't want to comply just do their bad things in other places because there's not, do you see what I'm saying? Like the law,
100%.
They don't work together.
One thing that's really important to know is the way that this piece of legislation is written is it's about the supply chain, and it's whether or not they have a gross global income over 100 million and whether they're doing business in New York. They do not have to be headquartered in New York. It's whether or not they want to sell in New York, which is one of the fashion capitals of the world. So very influential. And the fact that it is an impact on their supply chain means that the impact is global. And it will, of course, impact the supply chains of other companies, whether they do business in New York State or not, because many of them are sourcing from the same companies around the world. So that's really important. Another thing that's really important is that we are going through the ringer with this bill. We are engaging with all the stakeholders. We are digging up any of the potential hiccups, working through the political process. And ultimately, when this bill passes, it will be a template. So we know that there are at least 4 other states that have introduced this bill or a sister bill to this bill, showing that there is interest. And so really what we are doing is walking through the fire first, working through kinks, and then we can hand this template off to any state that wants to join in this effort.
And I think what is so exciting to me about this bill, Shelley had, before we got started was, talking about like, why do other countries not have stronger legislation? Well, some of the reason why Bangladesh doesn't have better enforcement of minimum wages is that they are currently at a disincentive to do so, because if they increase wages, demand increased wages domestically, currently the fashion industry would just leave Bangladesh. The beauty of a piece of legislation like this, as Assemblymember Kellis was saying, is that it's a state bill that has global implications. So it's creating the global incentive structure for why a company would not help create disincentives at a foreign national level to really end this race to the bottom. So that's what I find so exciting, is that we've been in this space. The U.S. history is testament to this. We developed the EPA and we had some basic labor protections. We need more. But once we did that, we developed this globalized world that hasn't been regulated up until this point. And then industry left. That's why there is so little, because costs went up here. And so the industry left. A bill like this sets that ends that race to the bottom, and develops that floor so we can start, a race to the top, which the beauty of it is it also makes New York State, it also makes American labor and production more competitive, because you're not competing against who can pay their workers the worst, and so I think that's to me, why I get very motivated about this bill.
You're on mute.
Brittany?
I do this like all the time. Once a day I do this.
The world of Zooms.
Yeah, seriously. What was I saying? So I can't remember who said it. I think it was Assemblymember Kellis. I think you mentioned that the impact on smaller businesses, but like how this isn't going to negatively impact them. There was a question in the chat that was wondering how it will affect small and medium businesses. And so it sounds like it's not going to negatively affect them, but will it positively affect them?
It could, for multiple reasons. They can't drive their own supply chain economically, but it will create transparency in their supply chain that will allow for marketing and outreach so if I were a small company and I have a retail store, I now know my supply chain because I know where I buy things, even though I haven't been the driver of that transparency in the supply chain. I can now educate my customers and create brand loyalty and pride in the work that I'm doing because I can create that education. And they don't have to pay for it, or they don't have to drive that. That is one thing that's actually really important. It will also create a more equal playing field because of the economies of scale. The very large corporations can influence the prices that are charged, and they're the ones that are really driving things down to the rock bottom. If we are creating a framework where they're not allowed to do that anymore, it actually will balance out the prices between the very small and medium-scaled companies and these large companies that are able, because of that economy of scale, to drive the prices down so much exclusively for them. Right, so it'll balance out that competitive advantage that they have had because of a total lack of transparency and regulation.
Nice. And then okay. Now I'm like paranoid about being on mute. But yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for answering all of these questions and sharing your insights and knowledge. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone listening did as well. I'm going to pass the mic back to Shelley, wherever you are.
Oh, thank you. I really want to thank our incredible panelists and moderator today. Thank you. This has been absolutely fabulous discussion. I think the only thing wrong is that we should have allotted a whole lot more time, because there are a lot of people that have come in, and it's really been so stimulating and just great. So thank you so much for being here today. I also want to thank David Becker in Washington, D.C. at Earth Day for bringing us all together so smoothly. And I also want to thank Michelle Gabriel for all of her help to me in putting together.
You too, Shelley.
Thank you. And finally, thank you to all of our viewers here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for caring.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very